So I hope we can start. Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth panel of the Holocaust and Cold War conference. The title of the panel is Jurisdiction Hungary. So in the next 1 hour we will discuss the Eichmann trial in Hungary in depth. And unfortunately, I cannot introduce our wonderful speakers because of the time limit, but you will find the CVs on the conference website. But still, welcome Kata, András, and Máté. We are very old colleagues and friends from Hungary, and this is my pleasure and honor to be the chair of this panel. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the inspiring presentations. My first task is to give a short summary about the core thesis of the respective video lectures. And I had the feeling watching these lectures that the presenters were in a lively dialogue with each other. We have not only seen the Eichmann trial from 3 different perspectives, but perhaps some of the questions raised by one presenter have been answered by the other. I hope you also observed this type of beautiful entanglement among the 3 presentations. In this talk, András Kovács carefully analyzed the discourse of the main political decision-making bodies of the concerned communist parties and offered insights into the dynamics behind this uniform policy strategy adapted to Soviet interests. The main statement of his talk was that the handling of the Eichmann-case in the East Central European countries can only be understood as a transnational historical event in a system-specific context. Kata Bohus analyzed the ways how the Hungarian press matched and diverged from the party line, which was discussed in András' paper, particularly when it came to the memory of the Holocaust. She also offered a different interpretation to the characteristics of media and public discourse, in which she stressed that in spite of the anti-fascist propaganda of the 1960s, the destruction of European and Hungarian Jewry and the processes that led to it were widely discussed during the Eichmann trial in Hungary. Moreover, according to her hypothesis, the politicized representations of the Holocaust should be considered as a form of adaptation of Holocaust memory to the given public discourse. In her media analysis, Kata convincingly proved that although the Hungarian Kata regime didn't intend to emphasize the Jewish catastrophe in connection to the Eichmann trial, there was nevertheless an acknowledgement that Jews were his main target and that the Hungarian state had collaborated with him to the very end of the deportations. However, as Kata also mentioned in her presentation, this narrative was not particularly new, as it had emerged immediately following the war. An enigmatic figure of the transnational arena described by András and the media landscape analyzed by Kata was the Hungarian journalist and Nazi hunter and pioneer of Holocaust studies, Jenő Lévai. Our third speaker, Máté Zombory, drew a very detailed picture about his ambivalent position in the Hungarian transnational public, especially during the Eichmann trial. Máté criticized Lévai's participation in communist revelatory campaigns against prominent figures in West Germany and his heterogeneous mission in writing and documenting history of the Jewish catastrophe, and at the same time hunting the Nazis. However, Máté argues that Lévai was neither a collaborator nor a dissent. In the end of his talk, he concluded that the complex picture of Lévai's activities raised the question why the concepts of Holocaust historiography and that of anti-fascism appear to be contradictory. I have prepared 3 questions for you all. Let me start with an emblematic quote from János Kádár, which I found in the paper of András and in the presentation of András. I will quote, "It's not a good idea to turn these awful fascist affairs into an exclusively Jewish matter. If we do act in this effort, the decisive thing should be that Eichmann murdered hundreds of thousands of Hungarian citizens. This is where the emphasis should be, rather than turning this affair into a Jewish question. Eichmann did not only murder Jews, others were there too. This is not a Jewish question. This is a question of fascism and anti-fascism," quote end. "Awful fascist affairs, exclusively Jewish matter, murdered Hungarian citizens, Jewish questions, question of fascism and anti-fascism. Perhaps we can agree that this could be a kind of origin to all of you if we are discussing the Eichmann trial. How could you interpret this quote in the light of your own research?" And my second question, it is quite ironic that we are sitting in a completely Hungarian panel, although it's really beautiful. One can ask why we do not go away in a pub in Budapest to discuss these particular issues in Hungarian. However, in the light of your talks, it's obvious that Hungary played a prominent role in connection with Eichmann, not only because Eichmann was responsible for the extermination of Hungarian Jewry, but also because this story is transnational, it's every moment. However, many scholars agree that meanwhile the trial transcended national borders, but it did not overcome national ideologies. Quite the contrary, the Eichmann trial facilitated an intensification of ideological conflicts between East and West Germany, and more general between the eastern and western part of the Iron Curtain. What do you think about it? So this was my second question. And last but not least, if we still have time to discuss it, as we all know, the trial against Adolf Eichmann was one of the first transnational media events on television. At that time, only a few people in Hungary had a television, unfortunately, but hundreds of thousands listened to the radio broadcasts and summaries every day. How did this event affected the Hungarian collective memory? And how did Hungarian Jewry respond to the trial? So this was my very short summary, because I would love to give the opportunity for you to give a short statement in five minutes, and then you can choose one or two of my questions and please reply them if it's possible. So thank you very much. The floor is yours. Who wants to start?
Well,
András, please.
I can start. So I do not want to repeat what I have said in the talk, in the recorded talk. The subject was a very general one. The subject was how the communist leadership in different communist countries handled the Eichmann-case. And I tried to reconstruct these events on the basis of documents surfaced from the communist archives in the last decades. These documents offer insight, a good insight into the mechanisms that, in one hand, resulted in a uniform policy strategy adapted to Soviet interests, and on the other hand, offered a limited space as well for maneuvering and creating possibilities for independent policies. So the main issues the Communist Party's leadership had to cope with were firstly an ideological issue, then a legal political issue, and then a pure political issue. The ideological issue was what was touched upon yesterday in the talk of Jan Gross, and now Eva's first question is related to that. The general presentation, official presentation of the Eichmann case was embedded into an official party discourse in all communist countries, according to which the World War II was a struggle between progress and reaction, fascism and anti-fascism, and the victims of the struggle were those who were on the anti-fascist side. So therefore, the persecution of the Jews did not have a place in this discourse. The legal political issue was a bit more earth-bounded. The issue was that the East European, East Central European communist parties decided to reject the official Israeli request for assistance in the trial, and adhering to the anti-Zionist line of Soviet policy, they declared that they don't accept the legitimacy of the Israeli jurisdiction, since it would mean that that accepting the right of the Israeli of the Jewish state to represent Jews outside of its borders, it would be a support for the Zionist ideology. So this was the second issue, rejecting the official request. The third issue was a purely political one. They decided to use the case in a propaganda campaign against the Federal Republic of Germany, which was depicted by their discourse as the inheritor of the Nazi past, and confronted with the German Democratic Republic as the inheritor of the anti-fascist tradition. And on the top of that, they had to cope with all these three problems in a way which would not put them into the role of the defender of a Nazi war criminal. So it was quite a complicated and complex issue what the communist leadership of the countries had to solve. So then in the recorded lecture, I have talked about the several rounds of the negotiations and discussions on the issue. And finally, I said that these discussions, negotiations led to unity in certain questions and to interesting differences in other questions. The unity appeared in the rejection of the Israeli request for official state assistance in the investigation. And additionally, it appeared in the decision that all these countries were ready to participate in the propaganda campaign against so-called West German neo-fascism, and they decided to use the usual anti-Zionist rhetoric for this. The differences are at least so important as the similarities. The differences appeared in the readiness providing documents with inculpatory evidence through semi-official bodies. This is what the Hungarians and the Poles had done, but not the Czechoslovaks and not the GDR. And the differences have appeared in presenting Eichmann crimes not only in the context of fascism and anti-fascism, which was the official ideology line, but as crimes against the Jews. The Hungarians and the Poles were more ready to do this than the other countries of the region. The most interesting characteristic of the handling of the event, at least for me, was that that the handling of the event appears as a sort of transnational process, a process which can only be understood in transnational context, but this transnational context is a system-specific context. So the Eichmann case, the handling of the Eichmann case, is a transnational historical event, but a special one, a transnational historical event in a system-specific context. Stressing system specificity is very important here. It means that transnationality is not only created by, let's say, the common importance of an issue in different national contexts, but by regulatory mechanism in interrelation of states incorporated into a hierarchically organized international political system. And this is a special case of transnationality. And this is a perspective which was not very frequently used in transnational analysis. And my point is here that the Eichmann case is an example. It is a very good example how this system-specific transnational approach could be used for historical analysis. So this would be.
Thank you, András. It's great. I just want to ask a follow-up question, a very short one. So could you please explain us shortly not the similarities, but the differences between the Polish and the Hungarian reactions? But because in your argumentative structure, Poles and Hungarians are in the same camp. But I wonder whether the intentions were the same as well. I can imagine that the political and historical intentions behind the similar reactions could be stressed in this analysis. What do you think about it?
Well, I think the Polish and the Hungarian authorities behaved very similarly in the issue, but the background was very different. First of all, there were very few Jews in Poland, living in Poland at the time of the Eichmann case, but there were more than 150,000 Jews living in Hungary. So that's a huge difference. Another important difference is that because of very different political and partly historical reason, in the second half of the 50s, so after 1956, Poland started to develop a sort of friendly relationship with the State of Israel. And this relationship was not limited to economic relations, so foreign trade and similar features, but it became slightly more than this. Certain cultural relations, the relations were built up, and cultural exchange and even certain historical threads were picked up in the discussions. And that was very important for both for the Poles, for the Polish leadership, and for the Israeli leadership. And then the Eichmann case happened. And the Polish leadership realized that if they take the official Soviet line, if they behave, if they will be on the hard side of the conflict, then they would endanger the further development of this relationship. So that this was a very important factor, what motivated them to develop a different type of politics. And then, as I mentioned, perhaps, yes, I mentioned in the talk, the Israeli side could accepted this, and the Israeli side responded positively to the Polish efforts, and the result was the visit of the Israeli foreign minister in the next year in Poland, which was an exceptional issue in the region. On the Hungarian side, there were no direct, the Israeli relationships did not have a direct impact on the behavior of the Hungarian authorities. Here, simply the existence of a large Jewish community and the presence of a very vivid historical memory about the deeds of Eichmann and the Eichmann Commando in Hungary did not simply allow to follow the more or less prescribed political line. It is a bit more complicated here, but this is the main factor of the for the explanation.
Thank you very much. It's a very important point, and I just want to connect your statement with Kata's presentation, because it's also a very tricky phenomenon of the Eichmann trial, that because of, the Hungarian government declined to give a legal evidence directly to the trial, then they published a lot of the articles and books and documents in the foreign world, which is really a kind of tricky strategy of the Cold War Eastern Bloc Politburo, that you publish the Black Book of Lévai, etc., in German, in English, and in French. It means that this is a kind of public sphere which we hardly ever calculate when we are describing the media in the 50s and 60s. And this is why I want to ask you, Kata, what do you think, what was the strategy of the communication in the Hungarian media, and what were the results of these which you analyzed in your paper and in your talk? So excellent. So this is now your round to give your statement.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think the main point where I would like to connect to András as well is this anti-fascist narrative framework, which is of course something that all the countries of the communist bloc share. However, what I was trying to show is that there is this anti-fascist framework in which indeed the emphasis is on fighting against Nazism and heroism. It doesn't mean that the memory of the Holocaust is completely oppressed, as historians have for a long time argued, or that this is an inauthentic memory. But rather we have to look at it as a discursive framework where actually this image of anti-fascism and fascism and the the victimhood of the Jews appear simultaneously on more than one occasion, and actually engage in a kind of in a discourse in which they both cross-reference each other. One example that I also gave in the talk is an article from the official newspaper Népszabadság of the Hungarian Communist Party, in which there is a lengthy description of a meeting between Eichmann and the Hungarian state administration during the war, asserting on numerous times in the article how they were fascist, all of them. And then 2 lines later, it turns out, yes, the meeting was about the deportation of the Jews specifically. So I would say that we should really finally abandon this idea that because there is this anti-fascist narrative, there was no possibility to talk about the Holocaust. So this is one thing. The second thing, also András mentioned about this another common element in the narrative of the communist countries is this attack on East Germany. And indeed, if you look at the press report of Binay Brit, which they did in various communist countries, including the Soviet Union at the time, this was one element that was present everywhere and was very, very prominent. Namely that many former Nazis were still in leading positions in West Germany. And I'm sure Máté will also talk about this. But for me, what was interesting that actually this is, again, nothing new. So the Eichmann trial from this perspective is also not a turning point or whatever, which it has been perceived also on numerous occasions. This thing about attacking West Germany started also years later, at least in 1956 in the GDR. And again, this is something that they share among each other. For example, there was one documentary that was made in the GDR in 1958, Ein Tagebuch für Anna Frank, a diary for Anna Frank, in which they actually filmed the houses of former Nazis who were living in West Germany at that time, and they, like a candid camera, even secretly followed them. And that was I think, broadcast in 1958, and the Hungarian media was very happy to discuss this documentary. So this is, as I said, something that is not a game changer at this point in time in the beginning of the 1960s. And the third point, which again I would like to connect to András too, is this like national interpretations, which can also be identified in the media coverage of the events in the various countries. And one important feature here, and this is especially true in the Hungarian and the Polish media, is that Jewish victimhood is very pronounced. I talked about it in my presentation, that actually this like historical narrative of how Hungarian Jews were rounded up, ghettoized, and then deported when Eichmann arrived to Hungary was absolutely the dominant topic before the Hungarian Politburo even got to talk about it. So there was this 1.5 months between the capture of Adolf Eichmann and until Kata said the quote that you also quoted at the Politburo, when the Hungarian press produced a very high number of articles in which they basically reproduced a narrative of the Holocaust that had been already there in the immediate post-war period. Again, one prominent example of a historian who produced this narrative was Jenő Lévai, that Máté will talk about. So, the Jewish victimhood was very much present in the Hungarian media. Why was that, despite the fact that Kata said that this is not a Jewish issue? My theory is because that this was actually also politically useful for Kata and the Hungarian regime. Why? Because don't forget, 1956 was only 4 years before. And after he was instated to power, actually Kata used this argument that this was a counter-revolution that was caused by Nazis, and that the returning Hungarian arrow crossed local fascists. So actually, 4 years later, talking about this issue again is actually pretty useful for the Hungarian regime. Poland, on the other hand, where also the Jewish victimhood is pretty pronounced, had a completely different reason for it, I think. Because, of course, the Polish regime that in general does not like to emphasize that the victims were Jews, but they do have this self-image of Poland as the martyr of the nations. And when the Eichmann trial comes about, they can see, well, Poland has a special place in this story as well, because Poland was a place where the first Jewish victims were murdered. So here they can again reassert their own narrative by using the Eichmann trial. And the final point that I would like to make, of course, these like publications in English and French and German and the Hungarian embassies and the Czechoslovak embassies who are, you know, staging kind of like events where they reveal documents during the trial. These seem kind of desperate if you actually read the press reports during the Eichmann trial, because it's so clear that as soon as the trial begins, the party and the propaganda kind of loses the terms of reference. They are not in control anymore of what is being said, because who is in control? The Israeli court is in control. And Ben-Gurion really clearly states around this time in a TV interview that their goal with this whole trial is to show the nations of the world that there was an attempt of extermination of one particular group here, and that's the Jews. So when the Hungarian press starts to report from Jerusalem, because there are Hungarian journalists sitting there as well, they cannot just, you know, ignore everything that is being said in the courtroom. And what is being said in the courtroom is precisely this, what Ben-Gurion said.
Yes, of course, and not to mention that the staying in the courtroom, you can find Hungarian survivors, former Hungarian citizens. So I think it was also a very colorful picture which the Poles didn't have that time. And I think it was also an important point why the Hungarian government reacted so resignated or this dynamics, which was described by András so detailed. I just wanted to ask myself why it happened that way, that the Politburo was so confused or puzzling. And then, yes, of course, if you imagine that they are also Hungarians or former Hungarian citizens there in the trial, actually Israeli citizens, but they are telling the story of the Hungarian Holocaust. I think it was a totally different perspective for the Hungarian government and the Polish one. But András, you wanted to add something to Kata's statement?
Well, let's wait.
Okay, because all right, because then we are now circulating around a very, very important and also puzzling personality of the trial and the Hungarian Holocaust historiography, Jenő Lévai, and I think Máté, this is the exact time to give your statement. So how can you put this really very, very interesting and important personality of the Eichmann trial and the Hungarian Holocaust historiography?
Okay, thank you very much for all your summary and all the talk that you put online. So yes, we are somehow discussing with each other, and I hope that we will continue that. So first of all, let me precise what my talk was about very briefly. So if I was to summarize it in 2 sentences, I would say that my talk was about the relative unimportance of the Eichmann trial. So my paper is not about the Eichmann trial. I think it is somehow symptomatic that we are discussing only the Eichmann trial with regards to Hungary when it comes to the second wave of the war crimes trials. Because I believe that the case of Jenő Lévai, who was a journalist from the interwar period, exemplifies pretty well the relative position of the Eichmann trial in the other international trials, judging Hungarian judging perpetrators in Hungary during the late 50s and the so-called long 60s. So if we have a look at Lévai's public activity following the mid-50s, we see that he already works for producing evidentiary documents, historical documents to the Hessen State Prosecutor's Office, to Fritz Bauer's prosecutor's office in the case of the so-called Hungarian crime complex, which included some of the main perpetrators of the so-called Eichmann unit sent to Hungary in 1944, for example, Hermann Krumai or Kurt Becher or Otto Hunsche and others. So I think it is very important to note that when the Hungarian Foreign Ministry commissions a documentary book from Lévai in June 1960, Lévai had been already working in war crimes related trials, related issues, and supports evidence to one of the West German state prosecutors. So in this term, in this sense, what happens in 1960 after Ben-Gurion's announcement of the capture of Eichmann is nothing really new. What is new is that from the perspective of Lévai, what is new is now he has the possibility to publish. Because we know from security agents' reports that he was always talking about at the late 50s, that he was writing a masterpiece, a four-volume masterpiece, which would be published by Yad Vashem. So here I think what is important in terms of Lévai's own activity when it comes to the Eichmann trial is that this trial, and not the trial itself, but the whole international affair around the capture of Eichmann gave the possibility to act for Lévai as an actor, and not only to publish, but also to travel abroad, to collect documents. He traveled, for example, to Berlin before the trial at least 3 times with the support of the embassy, the Hungarian embassy. And also he was, of course, supported somehow by the state party when he conducted research in Switzerland during the second part of the 50s. So I believe that in this sense, what is peculiar and what is important is the mid-50s. I think if there is a turning point, and already some of the presenters of this conference already mentioned or raised the question of turning points as a bad thing. So why are we looking for always for turning points? But if we are looking for turning points, I believe in terms of war crimes trials and judicial proceedings, the turning point is somewhere in the middle of the 50s. And just to follow up on what Kata said, yes, this anti-fascist narrative or framework, I completely agree with that. But I would nuance a little bit further this framework. I think if we want to position Lévai's narrative or discourse with relation to the state party, for example, or with relation to Western socialists, or with relation to Western anti-communists, engaged in the historiography of the Holocaust, then we see that somehow he uses neither the discourse of the state party, so he does not apply a Marxist-Leninist understanding of fascism, but at the same time, it is not a Zionist narrative either. And what on the one hand, he uses the word fascism, but on the other hand, he refuses this base superstructure economic explanation of Orthodox Marxism. So, for example, if you consider the differences between György Ránki's explanation of the Eichmann trial, at the very same time, who was an acknowledged historian at the Academy of Sciences, you clearly see the differences because Ránki said that the fascist attack of the East, of the Soviet Union, was an imperial act. Lévai, compared to that, uses a completely different discourse, putting emphasis on the Jewish experience and on the Jewish suffering. So I think that if we are to label him, we have to say that he was an anti-fascist, non-communist anti-fascist actor. So this is a proposition for you and for the conference to revisit the concept of anti-fascism, not to reduce the concept to the meaning inscribed by the communist parties, because anti-fascism has, of course, as a discourse and as an international movement, a longer history than the communist takeover in Eastern Europe. And also it was transnational in a sense, applied also by not only leftists, but also by non-leftists, even anti-communists.
Thank you, Máté. I think it's extremely important, and I'm afraid that we will not have enough time to discuss it. Why a Shoah survivor has to institutionalize his or her life trajectory to understand, to describe the history of the Holocaust. And I think it was not just Lévai. If you look into the life history of Raphael Lemkin or Simon Wiesenthal, etc., you will find the same ambiguities and heterogeneities of political orientations. So, but I think it's a very important question, and I would like to discuss it really in another form of meetings. Now we don't have enough time.
Can I add something, a short comment on that? Thank you for mentioning these so-called colleagues or counterparts of Lévai. Just one very shortly, Kata, sorry, and this is a follow-up on András. In my case, transnational perspective means that we put the activity of Lévai into this truly transnational network of activists with whom he was engaged in documenting the Second World War and especially the Holocaust. Just to give some examples, Robert Kempner was one of his most important contacts. He was in correspondence with Joseph Kermisch at Yad Vashem. He visited the CDGC in Paris in 1958. And he was in correspondence with the Vienna Library. So there emerges a whole transnational network of agents, more or less institutionalized, because some of them are institutions, some of them are individuals. But I think it is a very important aspect that you rose this sort of institutionalization as a resource for action.
Thank you. Then Kata, you are the next.
Yeah,
don't forget that we have 3 more questions in the chat box.
I wanted to add exactly to this topic. That's why I wanted to interfere to this transnational aspect, or like other counterparts of Lévai. When I was watching Máté's presentation, I couldn't help to but think about Miroslav Kármi in Czechoslovakia, who was a way bigger Marxist. I mean, ridiculous from a Marxist point of view, he wrote, but his life trajectory is so the same, right? He was also born in a Jewish family in Prague, was not religious at all, and then while writing from this amazingly awfully Marxist point of view, he writes the history of Terezin, he writes the history of the persecution of Jews in Moravia and Bohemia, and just like Lévai, he goes around the world, corresponds to survivors everywhere, corresponds to historians from Israel to the US. So there are double transnational aspects to this, I guess. That's what I was saying.
Thank you, Kata. It's absolutely important, I think, to count with this transnational network of Holocaust survivors who are professionally, trying professionally dealing with these actual questions like the Eichmann trial. So I don't think so that Jenő Lévai thematized the world politics, but on the contrary, if Eichmann trial happened, it was a kind of call for him to be active again. And I think it's amazing that a single man is responsible for collecting documents and publishing them, and they are the huge countries and states behind it, and they don't want to do it. So I also see these aspects of the story, why Lévai or Wiesenthal or other contradictory figures were so important in the 50s and the 60s. András, sorry.
Yes, I wanted to react on one of the questions, and this is connected to all that what Kata had said before. And this is a question that if talking about Jewish suffering was useful for the Hungarian government during the Eichmann trial, were the attempts to conduct trials in Hungary, 1260. So the first part of the question. I would say less than useful. I would say it was unavoidable. Whether it was useful or not, that's another question, because 56 as counter-revolution could be presented in the anti-fascist context as well. But because of all that what you said and what I have mentioned, the Hungarian party, the politicians of the Hungarian party simply could not avoid the issue. And the which is connected to this is there were trials. Quite interestingly, out of the blue, in I don't remember, it was 57 or 58, there was a trial. A group of Aerocross people were put on trial. They were murderers in 44, but they were already active in the anti-communist counter-revolution in 1990. And the message of the trial was to draw a line between pre-war anti-communism and fascism and the present situation. And this was therefore so interesting, because what all these people have done was known before. It appeared, so it was documented in the state and the secret police archives, but they were not put on trial before. And this is this demonstrates that there was a change of reflection, change of thinking in among certain Hungarian political leaders. And another issue which is important here, and this was your third question, Eva, about how did the trial influence the Hungarian Jewish, well,
everyday politics,
public opinion, or whatever. There was a very special characteristic of the trial which was not present in any other cases connected to Eichmann, and this was the Kastner case. As you all know, a group of Hungarian Zionists were involved in negotiations, in bargaining with Eichmann and with his troop in Budapest, and they were ready to pay large sums. They were ready to bribe them for releasing a number of Jews. And this was a success because but they are different estimations, but about 25,000 Hungarian Jews were not deported to Auschwitz, but to the camps around Vienna, and they were considered to be a bargaining chip in the hand of the SS, and most of them, or nearly all of them, survived the war. And this launched a huge discussion about collaboration and rescue. And this was used by the Hungarian party propaganda, because they pointed at Kastner and his negotiations with the SS as a proof of the connection of Zionism with neo-fascism. And this is a very interesting and particular issue in the whole debate, and this has had influence on the Hungarian Jewish community, because for the Hungarian Jewish community, what Kastner had done was rescue. But for the Israeli establishment, or for at least a part of the Israeli establishment, well, it was collaboration.
Microphone.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And thank you very much, András, that you mentioned the case of Kastner, because I think it's also can say something about Lévai's very special position, because Lévai was not didn't want to mix his political agenda with Kastner. And then the life also, I think the life experiences are also extremely important. Who survived in a concentration camp, who survived in the ghetto or in hiding. So I think there are many aspects which we can maybe reconstruct on the basis of oral history, interviews and ego documents, which can maybe explain these absolutely different political agendas of these figures like Lévai and others. But Kata, you wanted to react to András, and you also have a question together with András here in the chat box. If talking about the Jewish suffering was useful for the Hungarian government during the Eichmann trial, where their attempts to conduct trials in Hungary itself in the 1960s. It was also directed to you.
I think Máté's hand was up actually way earlier than mine.
Okay, but Máté has an extremely long other question as well. But as you want.
But can I react on what you said that about? Yes, seemingly Lévai was a single individual, but I think it's if we consider his entire public activity, it is a misrepresentation, a misconception. He was not a single individual. If I was to give a label to his activity, I would call him a front actor, similarly to front organizations in Cold War studies. So he was backed by particularly state institutions. Also, he had his own contacts from the war from the period during the war, with his connections because of his so-called Jewish paper, and he made interviews with the witnesses, etc. And this was useful for the Communist Party, and it was useful for the state authorities, and it was a strange kind of deal between the two agents. So they let somehow act seemingly freely as a single individual, Lévai, but they begged because they needed the knowledge and connections that Lévai had. Lévai was, not worldwide, but sort of globally acknowledged as a Holocaust historian in the 50s because of his 48 book, The Black Book, which was published by the Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I think it is very important. One of the core problems of my research on him is the relation to the state and the state party, and it is and one short comment on his Eichmann book. I think it's a good example that he intended to publish this book to the international audience of Holocaust studies avant la lettre, of course. And he even attached into the introduction the Israeli political police letter to him, Hofstadter's letter to him. So he put it into the preface of the manuscript. By this, he performed his position as an international actor, not at all communist, of course, of Holocaust historians who act on behalf of the Israeli people. And this was, of course, excluded from the manuscript when it was edited by the political actors. So I think this the reception of this book has another very interesting history. How the Cold War not only influenced the creation and production of this book, but also its reception. But I give the floor to Kata.
Máté, we have only 6 minutes left, but you have a very long question.
Yeah.
Please read it now. Kata is coming, but if we still have time, then please reply this very last question as well. Kata, the floor is yours.
I would partly react to the question and to András as well about the trials in the 1960s. After the trial that András was talking about, there was another one in 1967, in which I believe former Aerocross members, so very similar to the 158. Former Aerocross members were tried who were torturing and brutally killing Jews in Budapest in 1944. And if you look at, so there are several trials to answer Katarina's question. But if you look at the press coverage of that trial, which was also it was very much present in the Hungarian media, there are two things that stand out. One is they reiterate the same line that I was talking about regarding these are the same people who then in 56 were also troublemakers. And the second one is that to prove, well, our party is vigilant. We are not letting these guys slip out of our hands. We are truly paying attention that they are here. We know about them, and if we will find you and we will persecute you. So that suggests to me that the fact that they reiterate these kind of parallels again and again, I do think it is somewhat useful for the regime. The other thing I wanted to say again connects to your third question about the Jewish community. I went back to my sources and actually reread the press coverage of the Eichmann trial in the official paper of the Hungarian Jewish community, Új Élet, New Life, to see if I can see something that is different, and I didn't find anything. They did cover it a fair amount, but what came out very strongly was again this line of West Germany and the Nazis. And also there was one particular article that I think I also mentioned in my presentation that said, well, we appreciate that, or we do not deny the role of the Hungarians in the deportation of Jews, but we would like to point out that they couldn't have done this without the Germans. So, and I was expecting maybe that the trial would trigger like testimonies or letters about experiences. I think there was one testimony, but it was kind of like maybe fiction. So it didn't have any very considerable effect. And it is also interesting and intriguing, and I would like to refer back to what Tamás Sedner said actually this morning and also in his presentation when he was talking about Imre Kertész, who followed very closely the Eichmann trial and collected his newspaper clippings about the reports. And Tamás was also arguing how for Kertész, the trial didn't mean anything. Like it didn't change his perception of the witness. So I would like to keep this question open. Why? But it's interesting to maybe consider, that this was not considered as a possibility by Hungarian Jews to come forward with testimonies.
Thank you, Kata. And András and Máté, you have one minute.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I have one more question and I can answer it in a short way. This is about Poland, and the question was that while Polish-Israeli relationships were developing in the early 60s, then at the end of the 60s, Polish anti-Semitism came to the fore. Yes, it is indeed. It is like that. The difference between the two periods are that after 56 and at the beginning of the 60s, there was a reform line in the Polish Communist Party. This was a so-called THO, and creating better relationships to Israel. This was one of the policies of the reform line, but this was the trend was turned over from the middle of the 60s, the much more conservative and much more anti-Semitic groups inside of the Polish party became stronger, and this led to the reaction to the anti-Semitic change in the late 60s, which was in a reaction to the Polish democratic movement 67 and 68 as well.
Thank you, András. Máté, do you have something? Okay, sorry, we are actually in 1615.
Just one sentence.
Just one sentence.
I would speak, if I had time, about Lévai's ambiguous relationship to Jewishness. Three points. Next
time we will organize a nice discussion about the Jewish agency or Jewish formative political activity in the Eastern Bloc, because it's really a very, very important question which was not answered yet. But now we have to show how disciplined we Hungarians are. So thank you very much. It was excellent. It was really very, very inspiring. The talks, the discussion, and the discussion among you as well. So thank you again, and I hope to see you soon in another occasion.
Thank you.
I think Sibylle Steinbacher will come and say also goodbye.
Yes.
Hi, Sibylle.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I would like to thank you all, also in the name of Joachim von Puttkammer, for 5 excellent and very intense panels. Thank you so much. Thanks to the speakers, thanks to the chairs, also for your time discipline. We will now have a break until 6 o'clock. And then at 6 o'clock, the film Cold Days by András Kovács will start. It's not you, of course.
That's another András Kovács.
It was long ago.
Definitely, yes, of course. There is a small technical change, because the National Film Institute in Budapest, who organizes this live stream, they will not show it on the video platform Vimeo, but they will make it available via YouTube. So the only thing you have to do is to go on our conference website and on the program to 6 o'clock and to click on the link directly to the film Cold Days on YouTube. If you might have problems with that, a little hint, just try to clear your cache. In German, it's a Zwischenspeicher. Clear it, and then you won't have any problems. And we will go on tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. It is a pity that we will not meet this evening in person, that we will not have dinner together. It is a pity. So watch the movie, enjoy the evening, and we will meet again tomorrow morning. Bye-bye.